Hi, my name is Lindy Jung. I am a speculative fiction writer, and I talk on this channel about writing, books, and basically whatever else I feel like. Today we are going back to the fantasy world building series. This is the final part of the series and the first craft video I've made in a while. I've linked the previous videos in the series in the description box below. This has been sort of an ongoing set of videos talking about all sorts of different topics in regards to fantasy world building. So we've talked about ecology and history and culture and language, and today we're going to be talking about magic systems, religion, and mythology. But today's video is going to be a little bit different from its siblings in terms of structure. Recently, I've just been feeling really unsatisfied with the writing advice I've been giving, so that's why there's been less craft videos, more writing vlogs, and podcasts. As I've learned more about teaching in general, I've realized that the better way to help you guys is to give more concrete advice and examples to kind of show you what I mean instead of just talking at you about various hypotheticals and theories and abstract concepts that might not make sense. In other words, my writing advice recently has just been giving me the vibes of the writing advice that used to frustrate me when I was starting out. So like show don't tell, what does that even mean, you know? So instead of just a list of tips and advice, I'm going to try to give you some specific examples drawing from my own work that show you how I've approached these fantasy world building topics. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get started and go right into the first topic. This will be a pretty long video, so let's just go. Part 1, magic systems. Magic system is a term used to describe how magic functions in your fantasy world. Not all fantasy worlds have magic or have a heavy amount of magic, but a lot of them do in at least some capacity, and you want your magic, if you include it, to make some degree of sense. Because magic is such a broad subject, I'm going to try to narrow it down. In my eyes, there's a couple different ways to incorporate magic into a fantasy world. You can have a very grounded base world that sort of has magical elements sprinkled throughout, like Game of Thrones, or you can have magic that is integral to the daily lives of the characters in this world, like in the Grishaverse series. There are basically two ends of the spectrum. Your story and your world can fall anywhere in between those two. So that's sort of the spectrum of magic's presence in the world, but there's also a separate spectrum regarding the actual structure of the magic system. This will often be referred to as like a hard magic system or a soft magic system. Again, I believe this is more of a spectrum than like one or the other, but I'm just going to go over what those mean. A very, very popular example of the hard magic system is Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, which honestly I've never read it, but I feel like this is the one that people reach for when they want an example of a hard magic system. From what I understand, there's very much a built-in internal logic to the magic, so I'm assuming there's a lot of like hard limitations and rules, and that's basically what you're looking at with a hard magic system. There are limits to what you can do with it. There's usually a cost to using it, and this will often be the kind of magic system that's split up into a bunch of different categories. Another example I see is like the magic system from Avatar: The Last Airbender. To me, that seems a little softer, but again, I haven't really engaged with that series. But those are two examples of hard magic systems, and basically the main key word there is going to be that there are rules. There are rules to the magic. I think in hard magic systems, you'll also tend to see that magic is viewed as a type of science rather than an art. Again, you're thinking about rules, limitations, a deeper understanding of the complexities of magic. People might study it. The general approach you want to have with a hard magic system is that it's something that people can study and apply rules to and logic to. Now that we've covered that, let's go into the soft magic system, which is the other side of the spectrum. A great example of this is the Force in Star Wars, because what even is the Force? What can it do? What can it not do? We don't know. To me, a soft magic system tends to feel more faith-based than scientific. The rules are sort of fast and loose. It might depend a lot on the individual user. Magic's power and its capabilities might be tied to the character. Like they have to go through some sort of growth arc to be able to reach their full potential with the magic, which means that the magic has less rules because inner spiritual growth is a little bit vague, so that means that the magic they eventually grab a hold of might be a little bit vague, but it's okay because it's more of a metaphor. I think the big weakness that you can fall into with soft magic systems, and that's not to say that you can't fall into this with hard magic systems, but it's that sometimes they can feel like a plot convenience, like, oh, we need to get past this locked door. You have a spell for that. It's fine. There's a spell for everything. Now that we've covered the two basic types of magic systems, you're going to want to figure out where in that spectrum your story lies. If you gravitate toward one or the other in the media you consume, you might gravitate toward writing one or the other, but consider all of your options if possible. A hard magic system might not be the best magic system to use for every story and vice versa. So really consider the story you have at hand, your characters, your world, your tone, what message you're trying to get across, the themes. Which of these two will serve you best? The more sciencey magic system or the more like faith-based spiritual magic system? Also, again, this is a spectrum. There are no hard and fast rules. You can sort of combine them, find something that's in between, use both in one world, although that might get messy. You can do like a medium hard world, a medium soft world, just incorporate whatever you like. Now that we have covered the basics, I want to talk a little bit about some examples from my own work. I'm going to talk about one story with a hard magic system and one story with a soft magic system, both set in very different worlds with very different stories. And I want to sort of show you how I ended up picking each type of magic system for each story and what elements in the story sort of led me to this. The first book is Tiger. This is a young adult fantasy set in a world inspired by Korean mythology and history, but mostly mythology. I finished this book sometime in, I want to say 2018. It was around the time that I first signed with my first agent, and I think we were preparing to go on sub or had just gone on sub, so it was probably around 2018, 2019. Tiger had a soft magic system. The second book is Moths, which I've been talking about for a little while on this channel. You can follow its progress through the writing vlog series that I started a couple weeks ago. This is an adult dark academia fantasy. It's set in a world very much like our own, except alchemy is a real thing, and alchemy here is presented as a hard magic system. Alchemy is studied, it's regulated, it's got a long history, it has very specific goals and tenets. Right away you can see that Moths being set in the real world, I gravitated toward the hard magic system because I wanted to create more believability. You can get away with it, but for me, the fact that it's set in a school and that alchemy is a discipline that is studied, I needed to have a harder magic system for that naturally, because you want to really be able to put forth rules. To me, those elements just meant that I wanted a hard magic system for this story. For Tiger, the magic sort of came in with the world building, and I wanted it to feel very dreamlike, a little bit abstract, and so I went with a softer magic system. I'll also get into this later, but magic isn't really convenient to humans because most people, almost everyone, cannot use it. It's almost exclusively held by like higher beings, like mythical creatures, gods. Humans really don't get it unless they have some sort of like mythical creature lineage or are cursed or are blessed. Like it comes from their relationship with the gods specifically. So it's a much more spiritual thing. That in itself led to me naturally developing a soft magic system. And because human access to magic is so restricted, it can never really be a plot convenience. Most of the time it's actually causing a lot of problems for them. I'm going to cover 3 specific areas of magic systems in relation to these 2 books, Moths and Tiger, and sort of talk about the differences between them. I'm going to talk about number 1, who uses magic in the world, number 2, cost and profit, aka what are the limits and how convenient is it, and you know, what do you gain versus what do you give, and number 3 is role in society. So for Tiger, number 1. Again, I went with a soft magic system because of that dreaminess I was aiming for. There's not a very firm sense of time or place. It's based off of an amalgamation. It's based off of an amalgamation of various eras in Korean history. It's also very much drawing from Korean mythology, so there's mythical creatures running around. I think this allows for more suspension of disbelief. It's almost written like a folktale or a fairy tale, and fairy tales don't really have hard magic systems, so soft magic system was the way to go for me for this one. Like I said, almost all magic is held by creatures, goblins, and reapers, all of these creatures that inhabit the world that are non-human and don't take much interest in human affairs. There's also a couple of gods scattered about. The humans who do have magical ability that they can like use themselves are called godsworn. People will have like lines of godsworn in their families, and they'll sort of be like the god's spokespeople. They're in charge of like taking care of their wants and needs and tributes and stuff, and that's why they're gifted in return with magical ability. Number 2 is cost and profit. While magic doesn't have physical limits in this world because the beings that use it are pretty much all immortal, it often has heavy unforeseen consequences or ironic consequences, again drawing from mythology and folklore. The gods are pretty fickle, the mythical creatures, especially goblins, even more so. Like reapers will stay out of people's business, goblins will actively like place curses on you and stuff. So again, this is a magic system that is soft and not well understood by the people, and it causes a lot of problems, so that's why they haven't really tried to understand it. They just want to avoid it. Number 3 is magic's role in society. So the world of Tiger is one that is actively moving away from its traditional beliefs, so things like the Godsworn and the gods themselves are sort of being left in the dust. Magic is largely ignored, treated like a thing of the past or a thing that only exists in stories, and so this makes it even more unpleasant when the characters are forced to deal with the consequences of it, because people really at this point don't know what they're dealing with when it comes to magic at all. And so one of the inciting incidents for one of the POV characters is that he has a really bad encounter with a goblin and he doesn't treat it with respect, so it places a curse on him, and that just launches his whole arc. So because magic is more of a fringe thing and it's not well understood, and the people who still are able to use it, like the remaining Godsworn or people who are able to communicate with the gods in some way, it's almost like magic is being overshadowed, but it's still there. It's still very much present. Okay, let's talk about moths. The world of moths very much mirrors our own, except magic and alchemy are real. But because the world of moths is still one that should be largely familiar to like a modern audience, I feel like there needs to be so much more justification for magic being there. This is something I'm actually still working on, so some of the details of this explanation might be spotty. I really want to put a lot of thought and effort into designing a magic system that clicks into the world relatively seamlessly, that makes sense. Like, you look at the world of moths and you should be able to be like, oh, it makes sense that alchemy being real made the world progress in this way or end up this way. I just want to be able to like create that pattern throughout history that yields the world that moths is set in, and it should just make sense, and it's been very annoying and difficult to deal with, but I'm still working on it. So, who uses magic? We have alchemists. They practice alchemy after a lot of education, licensing. They have supervision from the Hermetic Council, which is like a governing body for alchemists. But the thing here is that alchemy in this world is basically a more precise and refined and controlled version of witchcraft, which is the traditional practice of magic. The idea is that humans have always been capable of magic, but in the same way that people have always been capable of math, the details had to be figured out and worked upon and expanded upon. So while witchcraft is sort of like basic addition, alchemy is more like calculus. Witchcraft is also less predictable in its results because alchemy uses a combination of, this is not the correct word, I have a different word for it, but I want to keep it to myself, conducting metals and runes that sort of specify the intent of the user. There's a lot going on, but metal and runes, and that allows them to concentrate their intent and create more precise results for their magic usage. As a result, witchcraft has sort of faded into the background. It is basically the equivalent of what like alternative medicine and things like that are today in the face of modern medicine. There are a lot of parallels with medicine. So there are characters who are witches who do really small things like make good luck charms and cast small blessings and sage places, things like that. It's tradition, but it's not super powerful, not in the way that alchemy is. Alchemy is a little complicated in that technically, yeah, anyone can practice it. Everyone has the ability to do alchemy. However, because of the schooling involved and the cost, it's for the most part class locked, so it's people whose families have been doing alchemy for a long time are able to go into alchemy. It's viewed as like a very difficult thing to study because it is very difficult and very intense, so like, if you could have a cushy office job and not bother with alchemy for the rest of your life, why would you go into alchemy? Number 2 is cost/profit. So this magic system in moths has an energy source. It is basically an energy, again, I won't name it, contained within all living beings that people are able to tap into to do witchcraft and alchemy. People have varying amounts of it depending on factors like their age and their physical health, but there's always a relatively finite amount within like a singular human body. That's why people will like work together for bigger tasks and stuff like that to sort of make like a larger battery for their workings. If you overexert yourself, you will have rapid physical decline, you might undergo strange changes, you might die or lose control of your magic, bad stuff will happen. But people are aware of their limits. And generally speaking, there's not much fluctuation in how much energy individuals have. If you're alive and relatively like healthy, you probably have the same amount of magical energy as the next person who's alive and relatively healthy. Really, it comes down more to how skilled are you and how clever are you about the runes and the metal and channeling your intent versus how much raw energy do you have. Number 3, role in society. This is the part that I am still trying to figure out. I'm gonna give you like the old version because I feel like that's a little bit easier to explain. So alchemy in this world has become commercialized. The like traditional alchemists think that alchemy has been neutered. The most lucrative jobs for alchemists are producing novel consumer goods that use alchemy and also pharmaceuticals. The traditional practices, the big ones like human experimentation, creating homunculi, getting immortality, those are basically illegal for almost everyone. Any human experimentation outside of pharmaceutical testing that is like regulated and approved and needs to go through a bunch of like animal testing before, that's really super illegal. So at this point, alchemists themselves and the practice of alchemy itself has sort of lost its mystique, and it's sort of faded to the background. Like, people will buy the goods, they're very popular, they'll buy the pills, whatever, designer drugs, beauty products, all of it. And they won't think too much about like what goes into making them. So yeah, alchemy is sort of an open secret that's not really a secret. Alchemists, I think, are used to hiding themselves in the shadows because they were persecuted in times before, especially the medieval times, and a lot of their practices are conducted in secret. They're very jealous folks. They will write their journals and notes in code so you can never ever decipher them even after they die. So there's like a peace, a balance between alchemists who like to keep to themselves and the rest of the world just sort of enjoying the fruits of their labor. So as you can see, there are a lot of different things to consider when thinking about magic systems and world building. Instead of getting too caught up in the details, I would say just come up with the basic broad strokes. Magic's role in society, who's able to use it, maybe like how much they have to study it or practice it to get to the point where they're like a skilled user, maybe important figures and things like that. In a way, a magic system is also like a culture unto itself, especially if you have groups of people who are able to use the magic. Do those people connect? How do they help each other? How do they compete? You want to think about the relationships that magic creates between people and society. How will the existence of magic influence this world, influence this society? To me, that is more important than figuring out the very minute details of how it's actually used. Of course, your mileage may vary. This is just me sort of being like a culture and society first type of world builder, but of course that's not going to suit every story. All right, with that, let's move into part 2 of this video, which is mythology. Mythology isn't always present or necessary in fantasy worlds, but it is one of my favorite aspects of fantasy world building, especially for secondary worlds, so let's just talk about it. Why not? Myths, generally speaking, I'm going to define as stories that are often fantastical and exaggerated and aim to explain some otherwise unknowable aspect of the world. For example, creation myths will explain how the world came to be. Origin myths might explain how a country or a nation or a people came to be. A lot of cultures will have some sort of origin myth for their people. Like, I think in Korea, it's like we're descended from a bear that like lived in a mountain and didn't eat for 30 days. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that. So I'm gonna go right into my example with this one. Tiger, as I mentioned, the young adult fantasy, very much rooted deeply in mythology. And I had a lot of fun coming up with my own myths for this world. I think it is one of the elements of this book that I still stand by, that I still love, and I'll probably recycle these myths for later versions of this book if I ever get around to that. I wanted to include a lot of in-world mythology. While I drew a lot from existing Korean myths, I wanted to make up my own stories, my own mythological history. I was also really interested in the relationships that characters have with various myths. Mythology can be a good litmus test for how a character views the world. Like in Tiger, the 3 POV characters, one is Godsworn, so she very much is connected to that side of the world. She knows it's real. She believes fully in all the myths, even though some of them may be exaggerated. The second one is slightly more skeptical. She doesn't full out believe these things because she wasn't raised believing them, but she has just a little bit more of that like dreaminess, that ability to suspend her disbelief and like believe in gods and mythical creatures, and then she sees the evidence for herself and is like, okay, yeah. And the third one is a denier. He grew up like in a cushy life in the palace. He's a prince. The like upper class in this world is really far removed and sheltered from magic and mythology because it's dangerous, so he has never encountered it, and he eventually has a very rude awakening about it all. So like history, mythology can matter in a fantasy world because of the relationships that people have with the stories they grew up with, whether they believe them or not. For example, heroic figures in mythology might be figures of admiration. They have like a statue of that person in the town square or whatever. People tell stories about him. People are like, oh, you're brave, like blah, 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 so and so. Myths with a moral, something like a fable, could reflect cultural values or serve as sort of like a guideline for people's morality. This can tie into faith or religion, but it doesn't always. It can be something like Aesop's fables, where it's just like this is a story about why you should be patient. And you kind of want to think about what cultural values your fantasy society holds before you dive into this. On a larger scale, mythology can be used to, again, explain how a world came to be the way it is, how it was created. This makes it a really useful tool for world building. You can explain the roots of a world, or explain how the roots of a world are viewed by other people without having to come up with like a scientific explanation in maybe like a pre-science world. Also, I just think it's kind of like a fun and interesting world building exercise to come up with these stories for your world and maybe even write them down. I think the main ones to cover are probably like heroic myths, creation myths, maybe origin myths, but have fun with it. Like, if you have some zany mythical creatures, why not come up with some mythology for them? Okay, part 3 of this video is going to be faith. In other words, religion. Generally speaking, and I am not an anthropologist or a religious studies person at all, I don't have religion. Obviously, everyone is going to have their own ideas for how religion came about, but from a strictly like world building anthropology and agnostic point of view, religion, generally speaking, came about as a way for early groups to explain and justify the chaos of the world and find comfort in it. This means that religion often ties into mythology. I feel like they're from a very similar part of the brain. Religious beliefs in particular, though, tend to focus on the cycles of life and death specifically, because those are the big, scary, hard to explain things, especially life after death. This is not always the case, and you can absolutely, in your fantasy world, determine on your own what the sort of existential pillars of society are. It can be something like heroism, honor, piety, but at the end of the day, religion is going to provide a higher calling or power to believe in. It can provide a moral framework for people to follow, and it can also yield strong communities and rituals. I do think that religion in fantasy worlds is something that I'm coming around to in terms of like seeing the importance of it. Without religion, sometimes like secondary world fantasy feels a little monotonous. Like, it feels like something is very much missing. Even if religion doesn't take a front seat in your story, in your world, it's still like an important background element, I think, because everywhere you go, people have come up with religion, people have reached for religion, people have found solace and comfort in religion and community in it, and I do think it's a very important part of human existence, even though I am not religious myself. So yeah, even as someone who didn't grow up with religion, I think it's very interesting to see how people relate to it, how it influences people's lives and societies in general. And I think that factoring religion into world building, even just a little bit, can provide a lot of much needed texture. So I'm new to this. Now, I should have said this before, but prescriptivist writing advice is for the birds. Again, this is going to be just based off of my experience and thoughts and observations. But when crafting a fantasy religion, I think the 3 core areas that I've identified that you want to probably develop in order to create a strong foundation for it and make it believable and make it feel like lived in are: number 1, the beliefs; number 2, the people; and number 3, the system. Number 1 is pretty straightforward. What beliefs does this religion promote? What is the core belief? Where did these things come from? What sort of like existential dilemma did they originate from? Because they probably originated from something. Are there any tenets or rules that are set forth for people to follow, like maybe dietary restrictions or prayer at a certain time of day? What beliefs are these rooted in? Do they just like not eat shrimp for no reason? Or is there some sort of like connotation with eating something from the bottom of the ocean, being away from the light of the sun? I don't know, something like that. What rituals are focused on? What focal rituals are there? Like life rituals, birth rituals, death rituals. And why are these important? I think one that people also forget is like union rituals or marriage rituals, because I think in modern society, at least especially in the West, these have started to become more and more like agnostic practices, but they are very much rooted in religion. Number 2 is the people. Is the religion organized or unorganized? Is there like a governing body that sets forth all of the rules and regulations, tells you what to do, sets up the party table for the big feast at the end of the year? Or is it more of like an individual choice? Is the practice more independent? Can you sort of just do what you want or live a certain way and still be a part of the faith? If it is organized, who are the central figureheads, if any? Are there any prominent historical figures associated with this religion? And what did they contribute to the religion? This could be someone who is like, you know, straight up like a Christ figure who changed the trajectory of the religion forever. Another thing to consider is, are there any divides within the broader faith? Are there like different groups that believe slightly different things from each other? And also, how do they relate to one another? Do they like each other? Do they hate each other? Have they been fighting, but they kind of like get along now, but it's really like tentative. And finally, number 3, the system. How does this religion function on a day-to-day basis? Like, what does a person who very much subscribes to this faith, very much is in it and wants to be the best religious person of this faith possible, what does their life look like? And what does a more loose version of that look like? Are there daily rituals that people partake in? Again, dietary restrictions or prayer? Do they have to come together at a certain time of the week or month or day as a group and do something as a community? Are there any major festivals or holidays? Also, what relationship does this religion have with its government, if any? And would you consider this a majority religion or a minority religion? So, now that we've covered the basics, let's talk about my experience with religion in fiction. So we're going back to Tiger for this example. One of the 3 main characters is basically the in-world equivalent of a Buddhist nun. However, the depiction of her faith and her relationship with her faith is probably one of the elements that I regret the most about Tiger. I don't regret making her a nun, and I don't regret making her religious. To my knowledge, I also don't believe that I wrote a stereotypical or offensive depiction of Buddhism. I actually lived in a Buddhist temple for about 2 months. Of all the religions, it's definitely the one I'm most connected to, and I feel like I at least knew enough to be able to draw from that respectfully. But overall, this character's relationship with her religion just felt very surface level. Because I don't have a deeper connection with Buddhism and religion in general, and because I kind of like dismissed those elements at the time that I wrote this book, all I could really think to write were the surface level details of Buddhism, and I just kind of copy pasted them. So this character keeps her head shaved, she wears robes, she meditates, she lives like a very ascetic lifestyle, and she doesn't eat meat or drink alcohol. And that was basically like the end of her faith. So if I were to revisit this manuscript, which I sort of plan to, one of the things I want to focus on the most for this character is bringing the internal aspects of her faith to the forefront and specifically weave them into her character arc a lot better. So that would come about through me developing the religion itself a lot more and developing the philosophy of it and the tenets and the history. She's sort of from like a remote temple that's far removed from the rest of the country, so there's not a lot of like government relationship or anything, but I think developing that religion's history and in general like thinking about the philosophy, thinking about how someone who takes full belief in this religion, which is this character, she is proud of her faith and she follows her life according to this faith. So I want to make the moral values in particular set forth by this religion a lot clearer. Also, I never gave it a name or a central figure to believe in, and I think that was a mistake. I just want to make it feel more like a real religion, like a plausible one. And I think I draw it a little bit further away from Buddhism, so it's not like a direct one-to-one. I try to develop some more unique details, and that would really come from focusing on the history and where it came from and how it developed. So yeah. And I think this would be really interesting because when you look at this character and her arc, already you sort of have her going from this very sort of lawful good character, very much a pacifist, and serves as a moral guiding point to a lot of the other characters because most of them are more problematic than her. Over time, she starts to realize that in order to protect yourself and your loved ones, you might have to resort to violence once in a while. And I think that conflict coming from not just her own beliefs, but also this like external belief, this big belief that she has abided to throughout her whole life, that coming into conflict with this realization that this is the real world and this is what you might have to do, that would be really interesting. So that's what I do if I were to write religion again, which I probably will. Battery's running out, so that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. That is the end of the fantasy world building series. Again, links will be provided below for the other 4 episodes or parts of this series. If you're interested in writing blogs and writing craft videos like this one and just general writing content, then be sure to subscribe to my channel. I also have a Patreon if you're interested in supporting me. I now offer the option of a first come, first serve full manuscript edit once a quarter. It goes to one person who is in the $25 tier. So check that out if you're interested. I do get a lot of requests to like edit work, so I figured this would be a good compromise because I don't feel super comfortable taking on like fully paid freelance editorial work. But yeah, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.